We want to protect the strong role of an engaged, committed United States in an international order, a set of international institutions and power structures that it had the key role in constructing. They want to dismantle that international order in favour of one. Presumably something that will be led by a rising power that wants to dominate, looks a lot like China to us. We think that's a worse world. We're happy to stand in opposition.
Here.
So I'm going to talk mostly about the big issue of global stability. We're going to bring several lines of analysis as to why we think we have a more stable world on our side of the debate, protecting the US as the world leader in terms of many of these institutions and using the power these institutions have, committing resources to making sure they can fulfill their missions. And we think that they invite danger, they invite violence, they invite the threat of global conflict. Before we get into that substantive material, a few points of rebuttal. I want to first engage with the Prime Minister, who tries to narrow the debate to a ridiculous degree when he talks about moderate isolationism. So only when there's a multilateral agreement do we intervene as the US. The info slide requires you, as government, to defend the US, keeping the affairs of other countries at a distance, and that this policy position will be institutionalized. That is the verb that the info slide uses. That norm, that way of making policy will be built into the institutions that the US plays a role in, governing domestically, but also at the international level. So you cannot stand on a squirrely position of moderate isolationism. You have to reconstruct the international order. You have to change the way the US relates to its role in the United Nations, or the World Bank, or the IMF as a leader, because it can't be, because those institutions don't just exist to serve US interests, they exist to facilitate cooperation between nations and communities, and sometimes the US has to trade off its own benefits to ensure they can fulfill their missions. That's not a good argument from you guys. Then, from DPM, he tells us that the reason for Chinese aggression, rising power, seeking to dominate, is because of American dominance of the international system. America's been too strong in pushing its norms, now China wants to fight back. We'd say empirically this is kind of questionable. The US has actually sought to accommodate China, we think, over the past 25 to 30 years. Look at its response to Tiananmen Square, where China indiscriminately massacred thousands of its own civilians in public. The US actually, within 2 years, restored diplomatic relations with that country in a way that it wouldn't have done perhaps somewhere like Cuba. We think also, look at the South China Sea right now. Flagrant violations of international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, China building artificial islands in violation of that very clear international principle. No, thank you. The US accommodates that. It allows that to go on. It doesn't start a military conflict, even when in past eras with other combatants, that would be clear justification for doing so, to deter that aggression and unilateral taking over of territory. The character of the two states is different. China is clearly expansionist. The United States has stable borders, doesn't have any ongoing territorial disputes. China, Senkaku, all these different territorial disputes. Taiwan, for God's sake, China is clearly different in character. So Chinese aggression is more dangerous, we are more fearful. But even if, no thank you, the US was the reason for Chinese aggression, think about the practical consequences of the US responding to that, realizing, oh no, we caused this, so we're going to be isolationist. What lesson does that teach China? It teaches China that aggression succeeds, right? Aggression is the strategy that gets us what we want. Because now the US is getting out of the way. All the institutions that it built that are constraining us, they don't have any force anymore. No, thank you. That's an incentive to keep being aggressive, to keep continuing to dominate, because we beat the US, we kick them out of their primary role at the top of the international pyramid. Finally, they tell us about the past. It's really important. The past is useful to make predictions about the future, but the motion is in the present tense, so past harms don't really factor into, no thank you, the weighing of this motion, how we actually judge it. Oh, and also, I want to talk about, they say we need to protect our own citizens as the US, so they try and narrow it again from the globe just to American citizens' interests. We think you best advance the interests of your citizens as the US government when you promote cooperation, right? Because cooperation helps you do things like get free trade agreements, strengthen your economy, economic benefits necessarily fall down to even the lowest levels of that society. Those benefits are best advanced in that situation rather than, no thank you, an isolationism that gets us into a more dangerous position. So, first of all, let's engage with this question of stability. And we need to first of all contextualize what the status quo looks like. So under status quo, the international order is comprised of a series of institutions that seek to facilitate cooperation, at least some people that's what they try to do. Things like UN, things like the World Bank, things like NATO, that seek in military economic spheres to ensure that states with similar values can cooperate to ensure that they achieve their shared goals. These institutions also have another function, which is to solve disputes between nations, to solve coordination problems where resources cannot necessarily be efficiently distributed if you have nations acting unilaterally. I think this is especially relevant to questions that Akira is probably very interested in, like the environment. He always talks about the SDGs, right? We think that the environment is precisely the kind of area where we don't want an isolationist United States to simply say we're not going to get involved with things like the Paris Accords because they're one of the biggest global polluters in the world, the largest economy, being pollution like factory in that way, very, very dangerous. Yes.
Yeah. I'll forget about it quickly. China has its 400 racial minorities as in on land, as you said, like Taiwan or Hong Kong, whatnot. Isn't that more priority rather than extending it to, like, for example, Spratleys?
China has minorities. What's your point?
Okay, China has own national problem within its lands, such as Tibet and Hong Kong and whatnot. Isn't that higher priority as opposed to extending its military in Spratleys?
For China, well, maybe it would be if China's government was perfectly rational. But instead, what we see is China overstretching, it seems, again and again and again. But it's much easier to overstretch when you're not having to compete with the US that has an active role in these institutions as it stands. If the US retreats, then China's resource commitment that's required to rise to the #1 position is much, much lower. So again, we don't see the relevance of that argument, but even if it was relevant, we still think it's not empirically valid in this case. And China ultimately stands for different norms to the United States, which are hostile intrinsically to that status quo structure. The status quo structure was built on the visions of people like Woodrow Wilson, who believed that human rights were an intrinsic right of every individual human being. China's conduct at the domestic level, how it treats its minorities, is clearly an example of how it would generalize to the entire world if it did take over in that way. So we think we need the US to have that role very prominent at the top of the institutions as a check on this rising Chinese threat. We think that the US is also likely to be a better leader in the international order, in the international sphere, because of the process of internal democratic scrutiny that its policies are necessarily subjected to. We don't think that any alternative, whether it's China or even if they don't buy the China analysis, who else is going to rise? Is there not going to be any international normative leader at all? Is there not going to be any arbiter of international disputes who can step in as a last resort, who has the coercive power if necessary, who has the resources, the funding, the normative reputation? We don't think that everyone suddenly hates the US. They maybe did in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War, the Iraq invasion, but the US still stands for, in the eyes of many people around the world, the vision of the founding fathers of that country: democracy, equality, individual liberty. Those are values that it still very much stands for on paper and in many of the things that it does in reality. So we're scared, in conclusion, of the world that they want to take us into. They want America to isolate itself. They say moderately, that doesn't make sense as a context of this debate. We think that what we're going to get is the international order crumbling, because the US is the centerpiece and the linchpin of that international order. The institutions of that order depend on US leadership, US resources, US funding in a way that means that if you lose that, what you gain is much, much worse, much, much more dangerous. We say, yes, of course, the US is not perfect. It's much, much better in the real world than any alternative they can bring us, and I don't think they've got any, so we win. Thank you.